right, let's go to Saturday. Georgia Tech and Syracuse. Nice little ACC matchup here. Georgia Tech, 3-point road favorites at the Carrier Dome or whatever fucking sponsor that it's called now that's bought the place. 59.5, 60. The total here in this game. I'm still calling it Carrier Dome. To hell with it. That's what I'll always think of it as. Look, I laid the points with Syracuse, minus 16 against Ohio last week. And a disappointing push. Looked early in the game like, oh, they got no chance here to cover this number. And then they ended up leading got the lead past 3 touchdowns. And then Ohio gets a touchdown to get it to 16 in the fourth quarter. And then there were no points after that. A lot of good and a lot of bad for Fran Brown and Syracuse in their first game. The good was the offense. Kyle McCord looked good. The Ohio State transfer took a little while at the beginning of the game for him to get going. But again, new program, new offense, new surroundings. Maybe it just took him a little bit of time to get going. But once he did, that offense was humming, and they really didn't stop. And he ended up throwing for 354 passing yards, 27 of 39. LaQuint Allen was successful running the ball, 98 rushing yards in that game. A phenomenal game for specifically Trebor Pena and Oronde Gadsden for Syracuse and the receiving corps. They combined for almost 200 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns in the game. But concerns on the defensive side of the football for Syracuse. They give up 255 rushing yards to Ohio on the ground. Their running back, Anthony Tyus, just did a number on that Syracuse run defense. 203 rushing yards for Tyus in that game against Ohio against Syracuse, rather. So, yeah, concerns, especially when Ohio brought back very little on the offensive line, and they're overpowering you at the line of scrimmage and running the football right down your throat the whole game. You got to believe that's a concern coming out of that victory for Syracuse, especially when you factor Ohio way down as far as returning production this year. Lost everybody, lost a ton from last year, both sides of the ball. And it was more of a struggle, I think, for Syracuse to get through that game than a lot of people thought. So the offense looked good. Defense, not so much. Parker Navarro threw for 181, but it was the run game that really got Syracuse in trouble. And when you factor in this particular matchup against Georgia Tech and what they want to do on offense, it's troubling for Syracuse. We know there's a team that's going to want to run the football. They have a mobile quarterback in Haynes King, where running the ball himself from the quarterback spot is part of the offense here for this team. They've got obviously a phenomenal back in Jamal Haynes. We saw what he did obviously against Florida State in Ireland in the season opener. So talk about a shoddy run defense against a weak Ohio team. And now you got to face a Georgia Tech team that's run heavy. You know, they're probably run first on offense with sprinkling in a little passing from Haynes King. You worry about that Syracuse defense. Certainly I do going into this game. Georgia Tech, credit to them. Looked a little sleepy early. Georgia State went down the field. First drive, Christian Veillere just couldn't put the ball in the end zone. Oh, my Canadian quarterback, man. I was cheering for him, but not a great game.
That was a tough loss. That was a late ad for me, too.
Yeah, that was. I mean, certainly, look, I get it from a spot perspective. You know, Georgia Tech was coming off the huge win in Ireland over Florida State, now laying a big number. We know Georgia Tech is bigger favorites. Last year wasn't great. They would play down to competition sometimes. But I'll say this, to survive that potential trap against Georgia State, win 35-12. Defense looked awesome again for most. After that first drive, Georgia State did very little most of that game. I will say this, though. They did run the ball a little bit, and Bayo threw for 210, but again, they bent, but they didn't break the defense.
There you go. That's bang. They couldn't get in the end zone. That was the killer.
Turned them aside over and over. A lot of turnover on downs. But again, this is still a much improved. I can say it now through 2 weeks. Definitely, it's a much improved Georgia Tech defense. The offense is still excellent. Like you talk about balance, 225 on the ground, 274 through the air for Georgia Tech last week in that game against Georgia State. I think the total move up is the right move. I think Georgia Tech with that run-first offense, Syracuse was just absolutely gashed, just absolutely crushed on the ground by Ohio. How are you going to handle Georgia Tech now? You couldn't handle Ohio's ground attack. How are you going to handle Georgia Tech? How are you going to handle Jamal Haynes here in this game? So I think Georgia Tech can move the ball, can score points. Syracuse, though, the better side of the football for them clearly was offense last week. So I think at home with Kyle McCord in the passing game, capable, I think, of making some plays against Georgia Tech as well. So I agree with the move up in the total. It opened 57.5. I'm seeing 60 now across the board. And look, anything 3 or better based on the matchup, it feels like it's a good matchup for Georgia Tech. And I had to downgrade Syracuse a little bit. Like, I thought Syracuse could absolutely romp Ohio. Ohio lost so much last year, and it was much more of a struggle for the Orange against that Ohio team. I still think it's a much more talented Syracuse team, but boy, going from Ohio to Georgia Tech, it's quite the step up, especially with what we've seen out of Georgia Tech here the first 2 weeks. So I agree with the over move. And at this point, I agree with the Georgia Tech move as well, because I just think at this point in time, they're a little bit better than Syracuse. Again, we only have the one game for Syracuse to look at, and it was against a team that's supposed to fall off big time in the MAC this year, Ohio, and they didn't exactly look dominant, and in particular, they looked pretty rough at times on the defensive side of the football, Syracuse against that Ohio team, especially stopping the run, which they could not do. C-Mac, what do you think here? Georgia Tech, Syracuse.
Yeah, you know what? I went with the Syracuse team total, and I'm just glad that they got there barely. I thought they might just get into the mid-30s or low 40s, which they did.
I expected more from their defense than that, and their defense was disappointing. There's no other way around it. It was a disappointing defensive effort from them.
I mean, all I say is practice this week should be, oh, man, stopping the run, drills, Oklahoma, everything you can think of. For Syracuse this week. But, you take from it, it's just one game. It's just so big, like you mentioned, because this Ohio team lost everything. Everyone thought they'd be just awful, and they gave up 250 yards on the ground. It was ouch. But the offense looked good. McCord looked good. What he throw for like 375, 4 touchdowns. He did have a pick, but he looked pretty good in that one. Yeah, the other side, that was a late ad for me with Georgia State. Just couldn't convert. You mentioned the fumble, right? Or, right down there, that opening drive. And they moved the ball. Georgia Tech, the defense looks good, but, they threw for over 200 something. They ran for, I think, about 125. They just couldn't get it done in the end. And Georgia Tech kind of tacked on that last touchdown and couldn't get anything else from Georgia State there. So that was a tough game because we talked about it last week. I thought it was kind of the perfect letdown. I didn't want to move. I sat with it all week. Did, and it bit me in this one. I just think there's a lot of hype here for Georgia Tech. The win in Ireland, back home at Sleepy Spot, they beat Georgia State. They look great. This is a game where the Haynes King turnover comes in. Raucous crowd on the road. He's looked great, these first 2 games. And if he continues like that, Georgia Tech's going to win 9 games and be very good this year. But now favorite to the 3. If you like them maybe under the 3, I get it. But no way. No way I want Georgia Tech. No way, no how. I'd be on Syracuse or nothing. Them giving up all those yards on the ground scares the shit on me. But that's where I'd be in this football game.
Well, here's the problem, too, and this is the one concern. Even though I think it's a good matchup for Georgia Tech, here's the one concern now. Okay, Georgia State, but Georgia State, they hired their coach late in the spring. It's a totally revamped roster. Take that with a grain of salt. And now with what you've seen from Florida State in 2 games, just how impressive is what you did in Ireland against them now after the way they looked against Boston College on Monday night, Florida State. So, yes, it's been an impressive 2-0, but I still want to see a little bit more. That's why I say if you like Georgia Tech, I wouldn't lay more than 3. If it were to get higher than that, I'd no longer be interested in Georgia Tech in this game because I actually bet Georgia Tech a small Monday morning when it was below a field goal. The over is what I like more, though, in this game. All right.